next speaker today. If you've worked with contractors, you've probably heard some of the discussion around temporary traffic management. So that's our next session coming up. And we've got Dave Tilton joining us. He's the former chief executive of Parallax, which is a business that was responsible for TTM consultancy. Now, Dave is currently the chair of New Zealand's Industry Steering Group for Temporary Traffic Management, and he gave me some notes to introduce him with, which I've foolishly closed on my computer. So please take it away, Dave. Also, just another thing around the questions, and we saw them pouring through Slido, so obviously people are pretty familiar with how to use that by now, but just remind you about that. And I've also been asked to remind you about the rating tool for your sessions within that same Slido app. So within the app, sorry. So yeah, please go in and rate your session. And without further ado, take it away, Dave.
Thank you, Fraser. Kia ora, everyone. As Fraser introduced me, I'm Dave, and I wear a bunch of different hats, but one of the hats that I'm wearing today is as the chair of the newly formed TTM Industry Steering Group. And TTM isn't the most friendliest of subjects for some people, and I want to ask a couple of questions to start with, just to get a bit of a gauge for people's understanding of this subject. So, who in the audience has heard of the Code of Practice for Temporary Traffic Management, the COPTM? Let's start with that. Good coverage, good to start. Second question, follow-up question is, who's heard of the New Zealand Guide to Temporary Traffic Management, the NZGTTM? About half. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is transitioning from one of those to the other. The first being the Code of Practice. We've lived with the Code of Practice for about 20 years or more, and the TTM industry in New Zealand is going through a bit of a transition. So I'm going to talk to that transition at a bit of a higher level as to what that might actually mean for the space that we work in and the contracting chain itself. TTM itself is a support function. Its purpose is purely to make sure people don't get hurt while we get stuff done. That's it. It's actually a pretty simple task, but it's made extremely complex with all of the factors and variables that go with it. So I'm going to break this down to 4 steps. The what, the why, the how, and the when. The what takes a bit longer, the other 3 are a little bit faster. I won't be able to explore everything that you might want to understand about the subject, but I'll cover quite a bit of ground, and I do tend to talk relatively quickly, so we'll see how we go. And I'll try and save some time for questions, because usually some of the best things come out with the questions. The first one, the what. So I mentioned that we have this thing called the Code of Practice for Temporary Traffic Management, the COPTM. It's been around for 20 odd years. It was last updated 3 years ago. It's been the foundation of TTM execution in New Zealand for that time. It's what most organisations lean on as evidence that they're doing a good job. It's the basis of our training and accreditation system for TTM in New Zealand. So every person that works on the road is generally qualified with something called an STMS warrant or ticket, so a Site Traffic Management Supervisor, and all of the other qualifications that surround that as well. TTM planners, traffic management operatives, TTM workers, all of those terms relate to qualifications that people hold. We move on to what comes next, the NZGTTM, and the framework of this is quite substantially different. So in April 2023, Waka Kotahi, who was the owner of the COPTM, released the NZGTTM. It's shorter, it's targeted at PCBUs, or persons conducting a business or undertaking. It's not a prescriptive document all the way down to the end user, the person at the front on the road. And the intent behind this guidance is markedly different than the COPTM was. It's focusing on managing risk properly rather than following a set of rules. So I kind of want to explore that last point a bit more deliberately, because what I just described is fundamentally a philosophical change from following a set of rules to following a set of guidelines or principles. And that's not something we're very good at in the TTM space. So any of you that operate in and around temporary traffic management, you'll understand that primarily our focus, our methodology for executing that is to follow a set of rules. As long as I follow that set of rules and I put the cones in the way that they're supposed to go and I have a certain width of safety zone, I'm good. That philosophy is changing. So to break this down a little bit, I kind of need to give you a bit of a picture about how risk is managed, how we manage risk in TTM currently. And we start by doing that by having a set of rules. I use the term rules as quite a general term to apply to anything that we put in place to try and manage specifically how we produce an end result. Our first set of rules are outcome rules. That's what we have by just having a law that says we have to keep everyone safe. The duty of care as a section of the Health and Safety at Work Act. That's an outcome rule. Just basically says the outcome that you have to achieve. Doesn't tell you how to do it. Outcome rules are great, fantastic. But they don't really give you a lot of guidance about how to give effect to that rule. If the outcome rule was enough, everyone would always be safe. But it's not. So it lacks utility. So below that, we put in process rules. Now, these process rules are great. They give you a little bit more utility. They give you some guidance on how to give effect to that outcome rule. So something like a hazard ID process or a risk assessment process. They're giving a little bit of guidance, but they're not prescribing the exact result that you're going to come to. These process rules, though, they've got shortfalls too. Process rules, they're challenged by needing decision making and judgment and competency to deploy them. So we add another layer below that, and we have prescriptive rules. So prescriptive rules tell you exactly what to do, exactly how to behave. The COPTM is full of prescriptive rules. I have another question for the audience. How many of you have been involved in a temporary traffic management site that has used a lot of prescriptive rules, and those prescriptive rules were probably not appropriate for the managing of the risk? There was a disconnect between the rules that were demanded for that particular site and what actually would have been the most pragmatic approach to managing risk, where there's a disconnect. Put your hand up if there's been a site you've been involved in that's had that situation. Right. So what that shows is that prescriptive rules have downsides too. Prescriptive rules seek to universalize the solution. The problem is they imply that that solution is universally effective. In all your cases, maybe across the whole system, that particular rule that you thought was inappropriate was good, but in your particular individual cases it was not. So prescriptive rules are not necessarily the answer to getting the best outcome in terms of safety. They do also rely on compliance. So our current system in TTM sort of looks a bit like this. Heavily weighted into the bottom right-hand corner where there's an extreme amount of prescriptive rules. Now, if any of you have had an issue with the amount that TTM costs or how much TTM is required or how many specific prescriptive, somewhat disconnected rules there are, it might be because there's a weighting into the bucket of prescriptive rules more than that, more than is appropriate. Or the system is just not structured in a way where that's actually working. And in all those cases where you had those prescriptive rules that weren't quite right, and they didn't fit, and they didn't actually manage risk, that you recognize that, maybe what you did is you reverted to a process or an outcome rule. You said, actually, that prescription's not working here. So what the NZGTTM is doing is basically saying, let's stop trying to align ourselves with arbitrary rules, prescriptive ones, and focus more on how can I actually get more certainty that people will be safe. So the TTM change that we're facing over the next 5 whatever years is actually centered around an adjustment from what do the rules say to how can I get more certainty that people will be safe. Philosophically, that's the difference. Now the right-hand side here, that's got some challenge to it, because I tell you right now, we are not very good at that. We're really good at this because it's easy. It's maths, it's 1 + 1. It's secure. This is abstract, unpracticed. And that's where our challenge is going to lie. The system, the framework that sits around that has got some specifics to it. So historically, in the past, all of these things have existed across the spectrum of the system of managing TTM rules. Right? You've got your outcome rules focused on the left-hand side there around the Health and Safety at Work Act, duty of care, must provide training, instruction or supervision for people, etc., etc. We have rules and regulations, so you've got the TCD rule, you've got the setting of speed limits rule, you've got the land transport rules, etc., all of those. And we've had the COPTM sitting in the middle, which is not a legal document other than representing maybe centralized minimum practice, and company documents and TMPs. So this structure is somewhat staying the same for the most part, except for the middle bit. So those parts of it remain unchanged. The part that changes is in the middle. And I'm going to focus on these three things, which are kind of the new parts of how this framework of TTM standards fits together going forward. First of all, WorkSafe published a good practice guide in 2022 for TTM, first of its kind. So the regulator, WorkSafe, has never stepped into that space historically. It focuses on PCBUs, and it has some real specific expectations about what PCBUs need to own in terms of managing risk in TTM. That takes precedence, certainly, over the COPTM. The second part to that is the NZGTTM. And as I said before, it is an entirely different philosophical document from the COPTM. It takes a broader view, a wider view, and talks about the outcome and the process, but not the prescription. And the last part I'll introduce is practice notes. So these are new. The NZGTTM does introduce this new component called practice notes. And the idea is that the industry has an opportunity to lead what TTM standards look like going forward. There's been a couple of examples already drawn up. There's one from Survey and Spatial New Zealand, where they've produced a practice note on how to manage TTM risk when you're doing surveying operations in and around the road network. So the opportunity is for industries or industry bodies to get together and culminate good practice into something that can be used that's specific to that context. There's some risks to that, but the opportunity, as I said, is for the industry to start leading what good practice looks like, rather than have a centralized system led by waka kotahi, where you have potentially a risk of over-prescription. Now, not to say that prescription is bad, it's just to say that in those instances, as we highlighted before, you get a mismatch between the treatment and the risk. Risk management for us in the sector is not new. It's not something that we haven't practiced elsewhere. If I asked all of you, how do you manage risk of someone working at heights? You would have some process backing to that. But how we approach that same question in TTM has been, what does the rule say? And that's the change. It's reverting or changing or shifting towards the philosophy that we've adopted to manage risk in so many other places, just not in this one yet. And that was the what. Now the why. So, as a lot of people certainly argued, well, what is broken? Why are we fixing something that has not actually demonstrated a failure yet? Well, first of all, that's wrong, because there is a failure. So, there are plenty of people being killed in roadworks environments, and in fact, the rate of increase of worksite fatalities, which is heavily weighted toward road users, by the way, is outpacing every other statistic. So we are killing more people in roadworks, most of them road users, faster than we're doing any other type of deaths and serious injuries. As one specific statistic I can tell you, once a month, every single month, we kill a vulnerable road user in a roadwork site somewhere in New Zealand. One a month. In 2010, that number was 5 in 1 year. So it's more than doubled in 10 years. our focus historically has been on leveraging this centralized minimum standard called COPTIM. To manage risk, though, you need a system. And each part of that system has to take the weight of owning some of how that risk is managed. And the weighting has been put so heavily onto the COPTIM to own that. The problem is those minimum standards, as they get treated, are insufficient to actually manage risk. And sometimes they end up with, as I said before, over-prescription. So the adjustment is to reduce the weighting of those minimum standards at the center and amplify the obligation on PCBU's processes and systems. The problem is the capacity and capability in this space to do that is currently undercooked. It's not something we've practiced, and it's not something we are going to be able to do easily very quickly. The how. So I'm just going to give you a couple of different things. There's lots of the how, but I'm just going to highlight a few of them. The first of all is the reason I end up coming to stand here today, is the formation of an industry steering group. So the recognition was that in times of turmoil and chaos, people tend to collaborate a bit more. And the Roadwork Safety Governance Group, which is a formation that was made around 2019 across the major Tier 1 contractors, WorkSafe, Wakakotahi, etc. They said, I think we need a bit more leadership in this space. So the TTM Industry Steering Group was formed. It's made up of 13 different people across CCNZ, ACNZ, Tier 1 contractors, road controlling authorities, and as the chairperson of that group, that's part of the role of the group, is to come and stand here and have conversations like this. There is a new NZQA-based credential framework for TTM coming. So that credentials framework will take the load off the warrant system, which is centrally managed by Wakakotahi, as that's going to get turned off in time. So no longer will Wakakotahi manage any centralized training or credential system for TTM, and it will be a non-mandatory system housed in NZQA. When I say non-mandatory, though, it's very, very likely that most significant Tier 1s and so forth in the industry are going to adopt it, because there's still a need to have some measurement of whether someone's competent to do work in the road environment. The first of those credentials should be landing around March next year, and it will be a risk assessment in TTM credential. Actually, we have, to thank for that, we have the Downer Enforceable Undertaking, which they signed, Downer and McConnelldale, both signed with WorkSafe about a year and a half ago. And thankfully, whilst it did come from a very significant event and a tragic event, the outcome of that is that we have a credential for all people within the TTM sector to get better at managing risk. And so that output should be out in about March next year, as I said. There is an expectation across, as this new system rolls out, for more and more collaboration. So we've already got 5 NOC contracts as part of Wakakotahi's State Highway Maintenance Program that are undertaking trials of the NZGTTM approach. And those learnings from those trials will obviously afford some information to roll out further trials through 2024 and then 2025. And there's other local councils looking to trial a more risk-based approach to TTM as well. Obviously, there's some procurement challenges with that, because most contracts just simply say as per COPTIM, which obviously is a bit of a limitation, and does make it really hard for that contractual relationship to try new things. There is a risk tool available as part of Downer's Enforceable Undertaking. They produced a risk assessment tool that is publicly available now. So if you do want access to that, let me know. I can definitely help you out there. So there's a bunch of organizations doing some work in this space to try and accelerate our understanding and adoption of a more risk-based approach to TTM. it's going to be a staggered approach. This isn't a wholesale change in one go, and particularly if you take the theme of what I've been saying, the biggest challenge in this is our capability to adopt this approach. It's not something written in a book. It's not a particular piece of legislation or a rule, and it's not words that are going to solve this. It's people's ability to consider and think about risk and apply that to TTM. And lastly, it's going to be focused on being evidence-based and risk-based, not this disconnect, as I've mentioned, between what the rules say and how the risk gets best managed. And lastly, the when. So over the next couple of years, we're going to see trials and people giving it a go. Over the subsequent 3 years from now, we'll see this new credentials framework get rolled out, with elements of that framework being come online, and that means the warrant system can get turned off periodically. So the STMS warrants that come from Waka Kotahi will get turned off as the new credentials come online. And they've committed to allowing that to happen, that modular change. Around 2025, we'll see the retirement of the COPTIM. By then, there should be enough critical mass adopting the risk-based approach that will be safe to do so. But Waka Kotahi have indicated they're open to whatever is best for the industry. They will work with the industry to do that. And lastly, around 2027, I would expect to see that the majority of the industry has fully adopted a risk-based approach to TTM, where the solutions that we generate are based on a sound and comprehensive risk assessment process, not just an arbitrary selection of random rules that don't necessarily have a connection between the risks they're actually trying to manage. So lastly, there's a whole bunch of questions I bet you've got that you didn't get an answer to because there's only a finite amount of time. Some of those might be the ones on the screen. One of the ones that I think you might be asking is, will a certain mayor in a certain large city of New Zealand get what he wants? That is, to see less road cones. And I can give you an answer to that, and it's not the answer that he might like, but the challenge is connecting those two dots together. Does adopting a risk-based approach to TTM mean less cost and less cones? I don't know, but I do know there'll be less cones in some places, but there might need to be more in others. Those two things have a correlation, but they're not causal. So if we conclude that less TTM is needed, then we're going about it the wrong way. We should first start with the question of what's the risk and what treatment is required for that risk, just to get the right amount of road cones. Not more, not less. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, as you're right. Look, you're right. I mean, I think you've summarised some of the questions already, but it's good to verbalise them. Hey, one thing I thought I'd just cover off, because I'm aware of the TTM Industry Steering Group as well, is that there's some work there to get like a formal sort of contact page and that sort of thing going up for the Industry Steering Group. So, you know, there'll be some opportunities to ask the Industry Steering Group some questions directly, or, you know, potentially anyway, in the right way.
And that email address up there is absolutely live and going, so you can email that any minute. You can also email that and say, I want to get on your contact list, and that will dive you into what eventually will come, hopefully in the next month or so, our first newsletter.
So yeah, there's some really good work going on in that space. Now, just I think we've got time for probably one specific question. I'm sorry, but yeah, we wanted to let Dave finish there, so give you the format. The top one here is, how does NZG TTM ensure, the new guide, ensure consistency between contractors, especially when clients utilise lowest price conforming procurement?
Okay, so that's kind of a moulding of three questions, but I'm going to break two of them down real quick. First one, procurement. Well, actually, the first framing question is, what is it you want consistency of? So do you want consistency of road user experience? You can see the value of that. Do you want consistency of procurement system? Well, that doesn't happen by having a New Zealand guide to TTM. Do you want consistency of the product that contractors provide? Well, actually, that's probably not something you want consistency of, because what you want is them to treat the risk they've got. So as soon as I hear the word consistency, a lot of the time it needs further questioning to go, what exactly do you want consistency of? So To seek consistency in the TTM system, first determine what is it you want to be consistent. And if it's road user experience, we already have mechanisms outside of the NZGTTM that do that. The TCD rule specifically says these are the devices that we have to use when we present messages to road users. So the consistency of contractor performance, as in they must manage their risk, well, that actually already exists. The COPTM doesn't necessarily provide that. It provides a set of minimum standards. And so you can still, particularly in the contractual framework, instigate quite a lot of mechanisms to make sure that a suitable standard is maintained. So the contracting PCBUs have a particular role to play in making sure that standard is upheld. The COPTM can't necessarily do that for you.
Great, thanks. So consistency of risk management is important in that situation.
Yep.
Great. Yeah, so that's actually up against time, but you've got an email address there. I'm sure the whole world is overflowing with questions about this topic, but there's lots more to come.
Yeah.
On behalf
I'm hanging around. Happy to talk.
Come see Dave and thank him for his time presenting to us. Thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.